Hello, Kim.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today?
All right.
So,
All right.
welcome to the Economics with David Walker this morning. And I think we're going to be discussing agriculture. Nick is suffering from technical difficulties. So, I have been asked to dive in real quick and catch up with what you're doing and have a discussion about this today. So, how's everyone doing? We'll start with David.
I'm doing well, recovering from Thanksgiving weekend, and I've digested all the turkey. There's still some left over though. And so, who knows how long we'll be having that. I know Sasha's up in Canada. They suffer, pardon me, they celebrate, I should say, Thanksgiving at a different time of the year than we do. And so he's probably already had his turkey if that's what they have up there. I don't know about Rick.
What about you, Rick? How are you doing today?
I grew up in Colorado, so I used to be able to tolerate the cold, but it got down to 59 degrees here in LA. And I was talking about, wow, winter is here and we're putting on our jackets.
59 degrees. All right. It's been, a toasty 30 something around here, but staying warm and like everyone else, the leftovers have fed us quite well. Hello, Nick.
My audio finally works.
And you can hear us. You need to turn it up a little bit. You're a little bit low.
A little bit low. Okay.
And echoey.
Okay, let me just read.
And we hear you twice.
Okay, yeah.
Have twice the impact.
There was a shortage. What do they call it when the electricity went out here?
You had a blackout?
Yeah, something like that. Destroyed all.
All right, I fixed your echo. So all you need to do is I'll adjust your mic. You go ahead and take over the show.
Okay, yeah.
Nice to see everyone.
Hey, Kim, take care.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up. The thing is the audio.
You're good now. You're good.
Okay. All right. Well, today we're going to be discussing the budget. Okay. This wonderful budget that no one ever discusses. And I can tell you at least all the college education I went through, we never, ever discussed the U.S. budget. So at the political science department, the MBA, the law school, LM and tax, it doesn't matter. Continuing education courses, no one talks about the budget. And so this is the first time, David, I've actually taken a look at it, and it's horrible. I mean, this is the worst piece of garbage I've ever seen in my life. And now we're looking at the Department of Agriculture, which I thought was about agriculture until I started reading it. Then I realized as a little bit of agricultural, a lot of social programs that are placed into it. And just looking at what, and I only have a very small experience in the Department of Agriculture. When my grandmother owned a farm up in Ohio, she was given a check, and she's a millionaire, given checks from the federal government not to plant a certain crops. That was it. And even when I was a kid, I was going, this doesn't seem right. You mean we're getting paid not to plant stuff? Yeah, that's what the government does. And I was going, okay, you're a kid, you don't know. So that's what they did. And now the thing is, I went through this budget, okay, and it's 30 billion. People don't understand how big 30 billion they're spending. That is the 8th largest private company in the United States, what they're doing. So I was going, what are they spending it on? And the SNAP program, what is that doing in agricultural? Anyway, that was a huge part of their budget, was basically giving away food. Then the environmental concerns, what does that have to do with agricultural? Tons of money going to agricultural. Internet, for rural areas, millions and billions of dollars to the internet. And then, of course, other throwaway programs, which you're welcome to read. It's all inside there. There was one commentary that I picked up, and this person was upset because they want a 10% increase. And if you look at it, these programs are failures. The SNAP program, we 40% of Americans are obese. So whatever they're feeding isn't the right thing to people. So you're looking at, then he wants like 11% increase to hire 4,700 more employees to put infrastructure in rural parts, which from the understanding I saw was 50,000 per household. You're adding 30 billion to the debt. And when I looked at the Department of Agriculture, I could only think of one thing: shut the whole bloody thing down, start again, and move whatever they have that's useful. There's a couple of useful things somewhere else. But anyway, that's my opening statement. And David, I don't know what your thoughts about the Department of Agriculture. I think the budget should be required course for everybody in high school and college, required, because guess what? You're not going to want to look at this stuff voluntarily. So I do want to thank the viewers actually suffering through this stuff that we're suffering through, and the people who bother to take the time to read this big giveaway program. But anyway, David, the floor is yours. That's my opening statement. I think it's horrible.
Well, don't hold back, Nick. We really want to know what you think about these things, So, but anyway, let me start off with saying that when I taught the economics of national security at the U.S. Naval Academy, we did talk about the U.S. budget. We talked macroeconomics, and we also talked about a lot of issues that directly related to the Defense Department. But you have to understand the big picture. And let me end up, talking a little bit about the big picture. There's two kinds of spending that goes on in the federal government. There's direct spending and there's indirect spending. Direct spending are the things that, go out the door with regard to cash payments. And the indirect spending are things like tax preferences and guarantees and things of that nature. Believe it or not, when you add together the tax preferences with the mandatory spending, which is direct spending, 90% of what a normal person would consider to be a budget, we've written a blank check. We don't control it at all, and we don't effectively oversee it at all. Let's take the agriculture department. The agriculture department has about $30 billion worth of direct spending, which you've talked about. And many of the programs that it's gearing with don't directly relate to agriculture. They may relate to food. For example, the SNAP program, which is for the poor and to try to be able to provide them with resources to be able to buy better food than otherwise they might be able to buy. That's a big part of the agriculture department. You've got the school lunch program. You've got the school breakfast program for poor families in order to make sure that kids have adequate nutrition in order to be able to learn. You've got expanding broadband, to rural areas, which has absolutely nothing to do with agriculture whatsoever. All right. And you've got a lot of tax preferences in the Internal Revenue Code that relate to agriculture as well. And so, as we've said in prior situations, we really need to step back and look holistically at the federal government. What is it doing? How is it doing it? Who is doing it? How do we measure success? And in many cases, it means eliminating a number of things, consolidating a number of departments, and separating the wheat from the chaff between what works and what doesn't work. It's interesting, Nick, you talk about, we're providing SNAP benefits in order to hopefully encourage people to buy better food. And yet we've got very high obesity levels. And in fairness, there are certain things you can't buy with SNAP benefits. But on the other hand, there's also a black market with regard to SNAP benefits where people can end up, trading their SNAP coupons for cash and then buying whatever they want. So, we've got to really understand that the baseline in government is not okay. It's time to step back, undergo a fundamental reassessment. Whether that's an expanded Grace Commission type concept or whatever, may have to be done on a piecemeal basis, but needs to be done sooner rather than later.
Okay. Rick Rausner, any thoughts? I don't know if you had time, Rick, to read through the department.
But I got to say, so when you do the math, we're spending $90 for every American to have per year to have a Department of Agriculture.
Right.
And a lot of the issues with food and agriculture aren't the fault of the Department of Agriculture. They're the way, some of it's unregulated capitalism. There are only 4 major meat packing companies in America, which lets them set the price for meat, which squeezes farmers, that farmers can't make enough. So it starts putting them out of business, and then you get more and more of the giant farming corporations. Like the deficit, the time in recent history that we did best with the deficit was under Clinton. And one reason was we were lucky. When you look at Clinton's administration, compared to the world events that happened under later presidents, Clinton was a lucky president. And also he was pressed by Newt and all that to move rightward but so I don't blame the Department of Education. And I think school lunches and breakfasts for every kid, which a lot of liberal states are putting through, are a good thing. You don't get poor kid shaming if every kid gets a lunch and a breakfast, and you get fed kids. And then the issue of obesity, some of it is in poor neighborhoods in America. There aren't really good options for buying healthy food. That's thing one. Thing two is food that's bad for you is increasingly delicious because since the 70s, 80s, food science has learned, how to make like food taste irresistibly great. 2/3 of Americans are overweight. And when you have that many Americans with that problem, it's not the individual Americans, it's how good bad food tastes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you with some of the programs that should stay there. They just don't belong in the Department of Agriculture. That's all. In other words, when you read through the budget, you see internet for all. What does that have to do with farming? Then you see climate change. What does that have to do with farming? Then you have the SNAP program.
Climate change has a lot to do with farming.
That might have something to do with farming, but it belongs in a separate Health and Human Services. It doesn't belong in the Department of Agriculture. So when I went through their entire budget, I only saw one thing that actually related to agriculture. And that was they actually spent money on research, which according to one person's testimony had a for every dollar, $17 was returned. He was the chair of the Department of Agriculture, yet he provided no study that backed what he said. He just says something. It'd be nice if he said, according to this particular study. The other problem I had is that their budget was increased, but what was their objective? Was their objective to have people who are better shape because you could put them on a SNAP program? Well, if that was the case, that didn't happen. So why would you give a group more money when they got a failing grade? Talk to me.
Well, part of the problem, Nick, and we want to hear from Susan too, but part of the problem is you have to link resources to results. All right. And again, there's two kinds of resources. There's direct spending and there's tax preferences and subsidies and things of that nature, which is backdoor spending, which is not even part of the budget. Okay. But it's 1.5 trillion a year. Government as a whole generally does not link resources to results, which is a fundamental point that has to be made. What are we trying to accomplish? How do we measure success? How can we link our resources and authorities, which includes regulatory authorities, enforcement authorities, et cetera, to try to achieve the best return on investment with regard to our financial capital, our human capital, and our other tools that we have? One of the things that the Agriculture Department was supposed to do was supposed to be help family farmers. As you pointed out, we have major agribusinesses now. I only know of one major family farmer, or I wouldn't call him major, but Chuck Grassley, senator from Iowa. He still has a working farm, believe it or not. I don't think he does it himself. But so, we've got this situation where government's grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget. And yet the way that it measures success is how much money do you give and how many people do you have? Fundamentally unacceptable, unsustainable. But let's hear from Sasha, and then we'll go back around.
Yes, Sasha.
I'm wondering actually why United States would default on all its obligations and will start from zero, and there will no debts. There you can create a very, very fundamentally sound economic policies, and from that point on, the country will flourish and will do extremely well. I don't know, because with this interest rates where they are now, just to service its debts, it's taking more money than Pentagon's budget, from what I heard. And I don't know why the United States needs this burden, really.
Well, Sasha, let's talk about what we can and what we can't do. I mean, if you look at our Constitution today, there's only one thing that's guaranteed that's a financial obligation of the United States, and that is U.S. Treasury securities and accumulated interest. And that Treasury securities means not just the debt held by the public, but also the debt held by the Social Security, Medicare, and other trust funds. That's about $34 trillion. And you properly point out that at current interest rates, because most of our debt is relatively short-term debt, we're having to not only borrow money for the deficits, we're having to roll over debt that used to be at a much more favorable interest rate at a much higher interest rate. And that's why interest is the fastest growing expense. But given that fact, we can't back away from the 34 trillion in debt. We need to do a better job of trying to put our fiscal house in order and our monetary policies in order so that we can moderate interest rates and reduce, the burden of increasing interest for which we get nothing. That being said, we could totally change everything else if there was the political will to change everything else. And the answer is there's not. And so the question is, what do we need to do to build the burning platform? How do we have a call to action? And what's the way forward to start to be able to reinvent government and re-engineer the base of government? And the first phase of that is going to be this fiscal sustainability, stability, debt commission, call it whatever you want, that's going to deal with mandatory spending programs, discretionary spending, and tax policy. But that's not going to deal with some of the things we're talking about here, where you do a fundamental review and reassessment of what government's doing, how's it doing it, who's doing it, how's it measure success. In my personal view, when you do that, you have a lot fewer departments and you have a total re-engineering of who's doing what. For example, commerce is about the economy and competitiveness. There's a lot of things, and trade, obviously, there's a lot of things that are being done by various different departments, but they're not at commerce, and therefore you don't really have the ability to gain the synergies to, be able to avoid redundancy, and achieve synergistic effects, if you will, just as one example. I know Rick's got his hand up, but Nick, you're going to moderate this thing. So.
Yeah.
All right. So it boils down to what it always boils down to with every department is getting government to be more functional and getting money out of politics. A lot of everything related to corn is a boondoggle. One reason that Americans are so fat and so diabetic is that farmers get economically encouraged to make corn, where you make corn syrup for sweetener, which is the worst kind of sweetener that you can put in food. The other thing is ethanol is a boondoggle. Ethanol costs more in fuel and resources than you get out of it. If we made ethanol is fuel made from corn. If you quit doing that altogether, you'd have more energy than we do after making all this corn to turn into gasoline and junk.
Right. Mark.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here, David, because I had a question based on a interesting conversation that I had yesterday and everything, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around this. How can we get rid of some of the waste that exists that is not necessarily government impacted? Because one of the things, as I've said several times on this show, and I've said it on other shows as well, I get around by mass transit, and I was having a very interesting conversation with our local bus driver here in Durham, North Carolina, and he was telling me about how a number of people are actually hustling the medical system, and these are folks that are homeless and everything. So he was telling me about how some of the folks that are going to Duke Regional will actually literally call and give the address of the terminal as their home. So then the hospitals are sending letters to the terminal asking them to pay. And if you know anything about an EMS ride, they're not cheap. They're like around $700 and all in that space. So you can imagine how much of this money is being wasted if they are doing this on a regular basis. And he told me of one individual that might have done it like for about half a year. So if you times 700 times 200, you're talking about a couple of $1 million that are being wasted if they're sending that bill to the Durham Transit, and the Durham Transit going like, they don't live here. I'm not going to pay this bill and everything. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about ways that we can counter some of these hustles. And I mean, I know that homelessness is a problem, and I'll leave at this point, because the other thing that he was talking about is how our local shelters know that those people don't have homes and don't have the homes to go to. So they are giving them tents, so they're providing the tents and the sleeping bags that they are using even as part of this hustle and everything. But Sasha, you may have a thought, but I was asking the question to Dave. Any idea of ways that we can get these issues addressed from the private side?
Well, first, the government is a monopoly, all right, and it doesn't really face direct competition, and therefore it doesn't have the same incentives that the private sector has, to try to be able to continuously push for economy, efficiency, effectiveness, productivity, all these different things, right? They don't have to be able to demonstrate that they're generating good value for money because people can go someplace else. In the private sector, whether hospitals, for example, there's for-profit and there's not-for-profit, right? But they have competition, right? And they need to be able to make a profit in order to stay in business. And so therefore they have an incentive to try to figure out what's going on with regard to this fraud. That's exactly what it is. It's fraud.
That's totally what it is. Yes.
It ought to be pursued, both civilly and criminally. And the people who are doing this ought to be held accountable for that. All right. But then, the private sector, being both for-profit, not-for-profit, they have an incentive to do that. Okay. The government doesn't have as much of an incentive to do that because it's other people's money, and the government's going to stay in business, irrespective of how much fraud, waste, and abuse there is, although we ought to have zero tolerance for it. So those are my overview comments, and I know Sasha's got his hand up.
I have a follow-up question.
Be able to say he's not the one doing that. I know he's not the one doing it. Go ahead.
David, you are relying on the Constitution that forbids United States to default on its obligations. Wonderful.
Well, only on debt. Not. We could default on everything else. There's no guarantee for anything other than U.S. Treasury securities. And just to clarify, Sasha, as of the end of the last audited financial statements, today, let's just say today, I think we have about 34 trillion in debt that is subject to a constitutional guarantee, but we've got close to 100 trillion in liabilities and unfunded obligations that are not guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. So the point that you make is real. Okay, there are a lot of existing obligations that we have that we are not constitutionally bound, but we may be legally, ethically, and morally bound.
Okay. Let's talk. Okay, let's not talk about the moral side of this business. Okay, let's talk about the real 34 trillions which are guaranteed by the Constitution. David, but it doesn't take a lot of calculations that it will balloon, if nothing will be changed and real soon, it will balloon in the foreseeable future to 45, maybe even 50 trillion dollars. And with existing interest rates, they could go even higher. Some people believe maybe they will go lower. I think in the short term next year, they will go somewhat lower because it's an election year and so on. That's okay. But then coming 2 years from now, 3 years from now, whatever. I don't want to speculate what interest could be higher, could be the same. And these calculations, 45 to 50 trillion at even today's interest rates, with regard to what says Constitution, it will simply impossible by the laws of physics and arithmetic and algebra and whatever you want to take. It's just
math. Just math. It didn't complicate it. MATH, just simple math.
Absolutely. So this, it's sort of engraved in stone, yet could be very difficult to comply under present economic conditions, at least where we are going right now, unless something drastic will happen and there could be found a way to actually start decreasing the debt. What do you think, David?
Well, look, I think, Sasha, the things that are the most important from a macro fiscal policy are debt as a percentage of the economy. And right now, if you look at debt held by the public as a percentage of the economy, it's about 98%, 100%. If you look at debts held by the total debt, which includes debt held by the trust funds, it's about 125%. That's too high. But what's more important is where is it headed? According to the Congressional Budget Office, within 30 years, it's going to be about 200% of GDP if we don't change course. All right. The second metric is interest as a percentage of the budget. And, we've already talked about the fact it's the fastest growing expense for which we get nothing for it. So we've got to do something with the third issue is how much of the budget is controlled. Back before, back in 1912, before the income tax, before direct election of senators, and before the Federal Reserve, 98%, 97% of the budget was controlled. We didn't write any blank checks. The only thing that was controlled is what we had to pay for interest. Today, over 70% of the budget, we've written a blank check, right, including healthcare, including agricultural subsidies, including all the tax stuff. We've written a blank check, and and so in effect, we've lost control. So I come back to say it's not just what needs to be done, is how do you get it done? If you think that we're going to be able to re-engineer government on a piecemeal fashion through the regular legislative order, you're smoking something, okay? So that's it's not illegal everywhere, but I might notice also not illegal in D.C., which is where a lot of our problems are coming from. So maybe there's a correlation there. But that's why I'm for a statutory fiscal sustainability commission. That's why I'm for a constitutional fiscal responsibility amendment. That's why I'm for a number of budget reforms. That's why I'm for a bureaucracy BRAC to try to re-engineer the base of the federal government. These are going to take a number of years, but they need to happen, and they need to happen sooner rather than later.
I mean, we could start with just balancing the budget. I mean, Clinton did it, and before that it was Richard Nixon who actually balanced the budget. And David, I looked at this budget. I can balance that budget because there's so much stuff in there that doesn't need to be there. You do not need to provide internet to somebody in Overland Park, Kansas, or somebody in the middle of God's country. You do not need to have charging stations all over the place and environmental concerns all built into this Department of Agriculture. This is just one part. There is so much fat that any moron can get in there and balance that budget. Those are things that,
Rick has got to comment. Just keep in mind, keep in
you don't
mind,
need to be a rocket scientist. You don't need to be a mega society member to balance the budget.
all of us could do this, but you got to keep in mind one concept: political feasibility. Whatever you want to do, A, has to pass the House.
Right, I know.
B, has to pass the Senate. And that means you got to get 60 votes unless it's budget reconciliation. And C, it's got to get the signature of the president. So individually, if we were totally in charge, could do it, but we're not.
That's because also the plan is to keep American public stupid when it comes to this stuff. Like I said, my degree in political science, they never discuss the budget. My MBA, they never discuss the political budget. Law school never discuss it. LLM never discuss it. The media never discusses it. So it's almost like it's this big $6 trillion hidden secret of all this mess, but it affects everybody in the United States of America.
One last thing, and then go to Rick, okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's why the statute, and then Mark, that's why the statutory commission that I've been calling for, that the speaker supports, that has bipartisan support, that is going to be the subject of a hearing in the House Budget Committee this Thursday, okay, is gaining momentum. And a key aspect of that commission is a significant citizen education and engagement effort on where we are, where we've been, where we headed, how we compare to others, to build the burning platform that we've got to make tough choices. And I take some heart and hope in the fact that the people are way ahead of the politicians. And if this thing happens and if they go about it the right way, it will put us in a position to make tough choices. with an up or down vote. But I know Rick and Mark have had their hands up.
So I don't know how you get anything done without leaders that people want to follow. We haven't had a likable president since Obama. So Obama got some stuff done, though he was a little bit too laid back. Reagan, totally lovable president, got some stuff done. Clinton, people liked him, but we haven't had a likable president. And this next time around, we got the same two candidates that people aren't sold on. So that leaves politics in charge of old people in the House and Senate and mega billionaires who get all their wishes to come true by just throwing a ton of money at politicians.
I would respectfully suggest the issue is not likability. The issue is leadership. And we have too much what I call, and this is a word that ought to be added to the dictionary, what I call laggardship, which is exactly the opposite of leadership. And let's take an example of that. The current two leading candidates for president in 2024, President Biden and former President Trump, respectively, have said that they're not going to touch Social Security. Well, let me tell you what that means. That means they're for cutting Social Security benefits for everybody across the board, 20% and growing starting in 10 years. That's the hypocrisy that we're dealing with. And now, by the way, if you look at the data, and I'm a data-driven person, and if you look at the metric that I talked about, before, debt to GDP, Obama was terrible. He's the worst, as far as what happened to debt to GDP during his tenure. Clinton was the best. And part of that was because he was a moderate Democrat, and he had a conservative Republican House. So they were forced to go to the right, not far right, but they were forced to go to the right, which forced them to be able to get the budget under control. And with strong economic growth, debt to GDP went down. And in fact, of the first 4 years I was Comptroller General, 2 of those years we paid down debt. We don't have to pay it off. It'd be nice if we could pay it down, but we've got to quit adding to debt to GDP. That's what we've got to do.
Quick statement and everything, and then I have a question for you based on Thanksgiving and all along those lines. But Nick, I actually saw this great commercial. This is the statement I was going to make and everything, that I was actually showing private business bringing the internet to different people. I think it was actually Charter and all in that space, but they were bringing internet so that people would have access to the internet on the bus. So some of that internet for all can actually be private sector that can help in that regards and all in that space, because that was a commercial that I saw over the weekend. But my question for you, you were actually the subject of Thanksgiving dinner and everything, David. I thought you'd be glad to know I'm the one that brought you up, but we were talking because we have a family of folks that are activists and love talking politics. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, because of having a cousin that's a little bit more on the conservative side. But one of the things we were trying to figure out is how a third-party candidacy, and I know that you are part of the no-label movement and everything, could actually be viable and feasible. And I do know that even in our conversations here, you talked about having a pathway to victory in order to even introduce a candidate and all along those lines. But I was just wondering, because it did come up in our family conversation on Thanksgiving dinner and post-Thanksgiving dinner, as to how that would be viable. So who knows? Mom might be listening, and maybe she'll hear your answer and decide to go your path and all along those lines. But I was just wondering if you could share some of the pathways, because Mom's not the only one. There are a number of other folks that are trying to figure out, hey, it sounds good in theory, but I'm stuck with the two that I'm used to, which is the Democrats and the Republicans.
Well, let me give you a No Labels update. First, No Labels is a not-for-profit entity that was the force behind creation of the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, the bicameral group in the House and Senate, that have been the ones that have made bipartisan deals happen. Whether it's the infrastructure bill, whether it's the CHIPS Act, whether it's avoiding a default to on the debt ceiling or getting a continuing resolution, they have been the force that have caused those things to happen. Not the leadership in the House and Senate, and not the President of the United States. All right. But what No Labels recognized is that a historical high of Americans believe that the country is headed in the wrong direction. 69% of voters don't want Biden. 62% don't want Trump. For the first time, we've got a historically high percentage of Americans that believe that life for their kids will not be as good as theirs. That is directly contrary to the American dream, which is to have a better life for your kids and grandkids and future generations than yours. And we've all benefited from that, but now people are increasingly concerned, especially in my case with my grandkids. So what No Labels is saying is, look, with that's what people think. They don't want the likely candidates. They don't like where we're at, where we're headed, and therefore, is there a pathway to victory in the Electoral College? As you know, in the Electoral College, you just have to win a plurality of votes to get all the electoral votes for 48 out of the 50 states. There's 2 that are different, but there are not that many electoral votes involved there. And in December of 2022, there was a pathway to victory for a third option, unity option, meaning different political affiliations committed to a policy-oriented, results-oriented agenda. That's the common sense booklet that's on the website, nolabels.org. In August, there was an update to the polling on 8 swing states, and there was still a pathway to victory at that point in time. We have gotten ballot access in 12 states. We're working in 15 others. We're on track to get it in all 50 states plus DC by the election time. And whether or not we will offer the line, because it's not a party, it's only president, vice president, whether or not we'll offer that line to a third option for president, vice president will depend upon whether there's a pathway to victory in the Electoral College in the spring. And we can't know that until we know who the likely Democrat and Republican candidates are. I still think there's a chance that Trump and or Biden may not be the candidates for the major parties, and we may have a brokered convention or conventions for the first time in a long time. And if that happens, totally different ball game. So that's kind of where things are. It is an option, but it may or may not come to fruition depending upon what transpires between now and the time that we actually know the candidates for the Democrats and Republicans.
Can you talk about the fear that people have that a No Labels candidate will suck enough votes away to like Nader did in 2000, like Jill Stein did in 2016?
Yeah. Well, first, the Democrats are the ones that are most concerned. Okay. And the reasons they're the ones that are most concerned is because I'll give you a stat I just gave you. 69% of Americans don't want Biden. Okay. 62% don't want Trump. So there's actually more that don't want Biden than don't want Trump for very different reasons. Okay. They're very different people. I don't want either one of them for very different reasons. Okay. And since the Democrats are concerned about their candidate and their candidate can't do something about something that people are very concerned about, and that's his age and his declining cognitive ability, he can't do anything about that. All right. So they're more concerned. But there's a fundamental difference between Jill Stein, Ralph Nader, and some of these other people, because they only draw candidates overwhelmingly from people who would otherwise vote for Democrats. So, I mean, they can clearly be a spoiler. Our scenario is we want a unity ticket, meaning the people can't have the same prior affiliation, political affiliation. One's going to be a former Democrat. One's going to be a former Republican. We don't know who's going to be on top. Both going to be committed to a bipartisan approach, committed to this common sense agenda, which is on the website. And as was the case in 1992 with Ross Perot, he drew equally from Bush and from Clinton. He drew equally. And that's the data that we say, that we draw equally. But the key is, can we draw enough to win in the Electoral College?
But if nobody gets
Rick, one last
I just want to ask.
One last thing.
If nobody gets a majority of the Electoral College, doesn't it go to the House, and then the House decides who?
That's correct. But let me finish. The current polling shows that on a one-on-one race, Trump beats Biden.
Right.
So the Democrats better be concerned about their candidate And by the way, the Republicans should too. I think both of the parties should not be nominating those two individuals for very different reasons. And we may end up there. And to answer your question, Rick, yes. If nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, it goes to the House for the president. It goes to the Senate for the vice president. One state, one vote. So, just like with regard to ratification of the Constitution, doesn't make any difference how many members of the House you have, how many, everybody's got equal number of senators. You get one vote, all right? And it would be the next Congress, not the current Congress, all right? So that's factually accurate, all right?
I want to ask David, you have been promoting no labels for quite some time. And the biggest solution now is to find the right candidate to run against these two idiots. Who would you just give us 3 names of who you think could qualify? And if we help promote them, could win? Who are 3 people?
I don't want to give you names because let me just tell you the process that's being used. Okay. It's got to be a person that's well known. It's got to be a person who's well qualified, who's well respected, who has a track record of working on a bipartisan basis. Okay. Who's willing to buy into the common sense agenda, which you can see on nolabels.org. Okay. Who can raise money and who we believe can win. All right. So there are a number of people on the Republican, the Democrat side that have been speculated about. There's a number of people that, that are being considered. All right. There will be a vetting process. I would imagine that people wouldn't be willing to commit until after they have a better sense of who the major candidates are going to be on the Republican and Democrat side, just that we're not willing to offer our line until we know that and see if there's a pathway to victory. But there are a number of prominent politicians that are interested. Unlike in 2012, when Americans-elect tried to do something very similar, in which, believe it or not, they came to me and asked me to run. And I said no, because in 2012, you had a sitting president of the United States who was broadly acceptable, Barack Obama. You had another candidate on the Republican side who was broadly acceptable, Mitt Romney. We didn't have the situation where the people felt that we were headed in the wrong direction, that the future was not going to be as good as the past. It was a totally different situation. Today, you can qualify for the presidential debates a lot easier than back then. And if you can't qualify the presidential debates, you don't have a prayer to win. Okay. And so the situation is fundamentally different today than then. And back then, they thought that people would take advantage of the opportunity, but they didn't because of the reasons that I just told you. But now we're in a fundamentally different situation, and now people are willing to take advantage, in my view. But we'll have to wait and see whether they'll have the opportunity.
Jacoby had a question, and I was definitely going to ask a question as well. But Jacoby, go for it.
Just a few things, cinnamon, I guess, around no labels, since that's where the discussion is. A few issues, for example, just me, for example, a few issues that I have with no labels themselves, because even though the common sense that you say that are on the website, it's spoken in platitudes, so it's more like a campaign instead of more specific things. For example, there's notions around the whole abortion issue which is out there. Same thing around action, so on and so forth. Things that affect people's lives. And so the no labels is still sounding like a political party is. And even though it does not have a top, there are rumors focused on having a Republican or a former Republican as the leader. But you said that it doesn't matter, whichever one commits to whomever. But then on top of that, one of the issues is that even in the platitudes spoken, they seem not really more towards the center. And playing off of the early polling, yes, you'll probably pull more from the Republican Party due to the fact of the conservative style policies that are listed on the actual website and the platitudes that it's spoken in, and that's who it kind of speaks to. And it will, right now we're basing everything on early polling, which is tough. Yes, Biden does not have the opportunity to change the biggest problem that he has, which is his age, because his actual his platform and his economic policies and a lot of things that he's done have been a positive. But because of his age and the negative responses towards him, a lot of people are overlooking that because he had a lot of successes economically. But again, just getting back no labels issue, for the party itself, at what point would you decide we can only get on 23 ballots? Do we pull out? Because we're only a few months away before the primaries and everything start. Because
let me say several things. First, we're not a party, we're a movement. Okay, we're focused solely on president and vice president. We're not planning to run for Senate, House, state legislature, Congress, United States, nothing else. Okay. Thirdly, the common sense agenda, which has 30 issues, was determined based upon extensive state by state polling in December of 2022. These are the issues that the American people were concerned about. And then there's a framework for a way forward. It isn't overly detailed for two reasons. One, the more detailed you get, the more people throwing stones at it, if you will, and the less ability you have to compromise on certain issues. Abortion is in there. It's by no means one of the issues that we lead with, but it is an important issue for a number of Americans, and so it is in there. There are 27 states that we believe are in play for a no labels third option candidate. In theory, we don't have to get on all 50, but that's what our objective is to get on all 50 as well as DC. But there's 27 that really are our primary target. We have not decided whether or not a Republican or a Democrat would be on top. There has been some discussion about whether or not we have a better pathway to victory if a former Republican is on top, but no decisions have been made there. And the last point is the decision on whether or not to offer the ballot line, the third option to a ticket, and what that ticket will be next spring, probably in March. But you also need to understand, if it turns out that there's a brokered convention and it turns out that the candidates aren't Trump versus Biden, then we've got the ability to pull the ballot access as late as August of 2024. So there's lots of checks and balances that are built in order to try to make sure that we're in it to win it, not to be a spoiler.
Hey, David, just really quickly, two things. I was really curious, and Toby kind of alluded to it and everything, but in your mind, are there any, and you don't have to say what they are there any positions that folks might consider to be centrist or all along those lines? And if I can ask a somewhat follow-up question, you've alluded to, and a number of other people on this panel have alluded to, the cognitive issues that President Biden has. But I know that there are some folks, including my own pops, my own dad and everything, that are of the opinion that that is not only a Biden issue, that is also an issue with Trump as well, that there are some cognitive issues even in his space, because my dad is of the opinion that Trump won't make it to the election, and it's not just strictly because of the political fallout of some of his court cases, but also because of his own health and all in that space. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts around that, because like I said, my dad, and I did not see him this weekend, but my brother kind of conveyed the message of where his thoughts lay and everything, is of the opinion that he might not even make it himself. So we might have two candidates that are not there because of health issues.
It could be. I mean, the fact is age is just a number. And just because you're 81, if you're Biden, or 77, if you're Trump, doesn't necessarily reflect what your cognitive ability is and what your stamina is. I know some people have raised questions about Trump. Obviously, he's younger than Biden, but again, your cognitive ability, your physical stamina is not necessarily directly related to your age. Obviously, the more seasoned that you are, the more that's likely to be an issue. But there are plenty of people their ages that are sharp as a tack, okay, and have great energy. So we'll see. I come back to what I said before. These two people are no way similar. All right. Doesn't make any difference really what I think. The American people don't want either one of them. The political parties are not listening to the American people. The American people are tired of voting for the lesser of two evils. Mm-hmm. I won't vote for the lesser of two evils, and I haven't at least 2 times in the last 20 years.
Yeah, Rick.
2 things. One is we don't know what the American people think because polls have gone to hell because no sane person says yes to taking a political survey anymore. So it's left up to soreheads and lunatics to respond to these polls. They've gotten worse and worse year by year. Used to be 1 person in 3 would say yes. Now it's 1 person in 500, and there's no guarantee that 1 person in 500 isn't crazy. That's thing 1. Thing 2 is
I don't think you've got real good data behind that, but go ahead.
I've just what I've read on articles on how hard it is to get people to say yes to these surveys.
I understand.
Thing 2 is Biden is not Trump. Biden looks like hell. He looks old as heck. He moves like he's a creaky old robot. I wish they'd get him on steroids so he'd move a little better. But when you listen to him, he seems like he knows the issues and he's still able to think well. And he has 70% more experience holding national level political office than anyone in history who's ever run for president. And he's got 47 years of experience, which is nobody else comes close. LBJ and Ford each had 27 years. He's got almost double that.
Well, but that doesn't mean you got results.
That doesn't mean you're competent and you know what you're doing.
No,
It just means you've been there for a long time. And
look what's happened over that period of time. Are we better off today than we were 47 years ago?
Yes. I'd rather live now than 47 years ago.
Are we better off today than we were in January of 2021? Those are the kind of questions people are going to ask. That's the kind of question they're going to ask. Yeah.
If you like a credit card economy, then you're right. You're better off. But he's putting everything on a bloody credit card. And the real problem is the bill will become due someday. That's the problem.
Well, in fairness, both Trump and Biden were bad fiscally. Okay,
Trump 25% of all national debt accrued under Trump. They're both
shocked. What I was shocked at,
horrible choices,
is that when you look at the data on debt to GDP during time in office, the one that was the worst was Obama.
Yeah,
so not even close.
So now we've gotten ourselves into this mess, and let me tell you something. What's his name? Biden was never a mental rock star. He went to 3rd tier law school and graduated in the bottom of his class. That guy is not anything beyond a mental midget. So to put him in the highest position in the land is absolutely ridiculous. He's putting everything on a credit card, and ultimately everybody's going to pay through it. When you go to McDonald's and you go for a hamburger, they say, "Oh, hamburger, $10,000." Why is that? Because you're paying through inflation. That's going to be the way that we paid for it, because we're not going to increase the taxes. We're going to increase the debt. So watch inflation just go out of control. Welcome to Venezuela. So he's putting us into a 3rd world country. Thank you, Joe. Anyway.
Toby and then Rick.
Oh, we're at the hour, so we have to go.
You know that I was about to come back at you with everything you said was incorrect.